Hi, I'm Charlie Mato-Toyela with Blue Bear Flutes. Our website, bluebearflutes.com, could be where you found this video, or maybe on our YouTube channel, or maybe some kind of advertisement we ran on Instagram, because we do have a lot of photos and great things on our Instagram channel, which is also Blue Bear Flutes. This video is our 12-week flute playing class, and today's lesson is week number 8, traditional stories about the Native American flute and what is traditional. So we're going to discuss a couple of ideas there and some things that you may know, may not know, as well as techniques for playing the flute, which is so very important. As a matter of fact, as far as playing the flute goes, today's techniques that we discuss may be some of the most important ones that you'll ever hear in this 12-week course, particularly for beginners. However, I do find that a lot of intermediate flute players find our courses very helpful as well. So sit back and relax. If you have your flute with you, it's definitely a good idea. We can practice playing the flute as we usually do at the beginning of each of these classes. And then I'll tell you a few traditional stories that are kind of nice. I've got some that I remember, some that I've got from books here, which are actually historical documents. And then we'll go from there. So once again, if you have your flute nearby, if I can recommend to you to please pick it up, and as I always recommend, feel your fingers on the holes. If you have tactile difficulties where your fingerings aren't something you can feel under your fingers, believe you me, I know what that's like. I've been that way a number of times, but it's very important to be able to make sure that the holes are closed properly. So if you do have sensation in your fingers, make sure that you can touch the holes and cover them properly. So that's very important to make sure that the flute plays properly. Now, if you have a extra fingering or playing one of those modern 6-hole flutes, which has a hole right here, somewhat out of place from historical, the hole there, if your flute maker has advised you to keep it covered with a piece of leather or tape or anything like that, feel free to do so. If you have to keep it covered with your finger, go ahead and do that, although I will recommend putting something over it simply so that you don't get confused with the difficulty of uncovering that hole, because for the most part you will rarely ever use that fingering. If you find that you need that fingering, we do have videos, of course, on how to play that note, which is an off key. We're talking about the modern, as I call it, 6-hole Native American flute. If you need to play that note, there is a way, of course, to play that note. So it's something like this on a 5-hole flute. But for the time being, like I say, pick it up, cover the holes, and then uncover all the holes, starting at all holes uncovered, minus that 6-hole if that's what you've got, all holes uncovered. You want to cover each hole individually, and if you're not a musician, as you're a beginner, you want to think to yourself how you're covering the holes. That is really important. It's not something I've mentioned before, but it does tie into this week's techniques that we're going to talk about here shortly. But how you cover those holes and thinking about how you're going to cover those holes is so important. That way you don't and not mean to do that on purpose. I feel like I can't do it accidentally these days, but if you're a beginning flute player, you want to think about the speed at which you play these notes as you go down the scale. Either one steady speed or using the techniques we've mentioned in previous videos. So there are a number of things you can consider, but considering them is really the most important part. Don't forget to think about what you're doing. You can get swept away by playing this instrument, but if you stop once in a while and think about it, it ensures that you do the next thing that you want to. Once again, a technique we'll talk about here shortly, but practicing breathing and practicing the scale are critical. Now, you notice I breathe through my mouth. We've talked a lot about breathing through your nose. And although it might seem kind of silly, I believe, and I'm pretty sure scientifically, that I am speaking correctly when I say that you get more usable oxygen in through your nose than you do through your mouth. When it passes through your nose, even though you're not gulping it like you tend to do with your mouth, passing through your nose actually enriches all of the areas that use oxygen all the way down to the bottom of your lungs, which is super important. And if you noticed, I played for a longer period of time because I didn't feel as if I'm gasping for air. But when you breathe big gulps of air through your mouth, you'll feel like you're gasping sometimes because the air isn't as rich, probably because there's a lot of exhalation that needed to have taken place before you inhaled. But you'll find that your breathing seems like it's a little limited compared to when you breathe through your nose. Me, of course, you can tell how I talk. I can go on forever, and that means that I have gotten a lot of oxygen, which I guess is a good thing for me, maybe not for all of you. A little joke there. But anyway, make sure that you breathe well. Remember your posture. Right now, my arms are a little open from my body. I'm not holding the flute too close to my body and not so far out that it looks kind of uncomfortable, but I'm kind of close to my body here. I'm relaxed, and that's the most important thing, is make sure that you can be relaxed. How you hold the flute also determines how you play the flute. It's like I tell my kids, who are all musicians, how you practice and how you perform are really similar. So if you practice something in one way, how you perform it is going to probably be like how you practice it. So make sure that you practice in a way that you expect, is going to give you good results when you perform. Once again, performing is the week number 11 lesson, so we'll get to that when we get to it. But for right now, like I say, make sure you practice breathing. So make sure you practice breathing well. Make sure you practice good posture and good fingering so that you're holding the flute in a way that you don't feel like you're going to drop it when you take your fingers off. And like I say, keep on with everything you've learned in the previous lessons and make sure you focus on practicing that scale. Sounds silly, and like I've said before, there will be people who get up on a stage and perform a flute scale, which is kind of boring, and an experienced flute player will be like, but you just practice that scale. That's what's going to give you the techniques and the ability to know what it is that you're going to play next, which, like I said, is a technique we're going to talk about in just a minute. So that having been said, traditional stories about the Native American flute, there's not a lot of them. There are a couple. However, a lot of traditional stories kind of get lost. Historically, Native people usually told stories orally, and we have what people call an oral tradition. That oral tradition changes and grows over time, and things become more popular and less popular, and whether that be before Columbus landed or after he landed, that kind of thing happens. Historically, there are a few written accounts of Native American, stories about flutes, and we have to rely on most of the oral ones. So I will tell you in a moment a story, one of my favorite origin stories of the flute and where it comes from. But in the meantime, I'd like to tell you where you can get more information, because that's really the key, and a lot of you are probably pen in hand ready to write all this stuff down. But I would like to tell you there are a number of other resources out there in the world that you can get information from. However, one of my favorite books about Cherokee, my family stories, is written back in the late 1800s by a man named James Mooney, who lived with Cherokee Indians for a while and was very interested in their culture, was kind of accepted in, I guess I should say, by the people. And James Mooney's been gone since the early 1920s, but his legacy of stories and everything we've learned about him has been left behind. There are a few other people like Swimmer, who is a Cherokee historian and medicine man who had written a book you can find. Actually, Swimmer was a man who left a lot of his ideas behind for us, which is good, because I guess when a culture is, I hate to say taken over by another culture, but when it is changed by its proximity to another culture, I guess I could say, when that happens, a lot of new habits and hobbies and things take place. I mean, even Swimmer himself, for example, has a traditional like 1800s necktie on, and that wasn't something I believe he probably would have worn back in the day when Columbus hadn't been here yet. So there's a lot of things like that. Buttons, are something that we had an appreciation for. And yes, there were historical buttons before Columbus landed, but were they round and made with two little holes and this kind of thing? Things are a little different today than what they used to be. Basic point. But Myths of the Cherokee by James Mooney, pretty much a very accepted book by numerous historians. A lot of really great stories. The story I'm going to read in there for you in a moment is not a story specifically about the flute, but you'll see what its purpose is, because that's one of our techniques we're going to talk about today. I do have some newer books here to show you as well. Here's a book, Living Stories of the Cherokee. Living Stories of the Cherokee, written in more recent times, I should say, not too far back anyway. Let's see if we can find a published date here. 1998, University of North Carolina Press. This book was collected and edited by Barbara R. Duncan, with a foreword by former Chief Joyce Consine Dugan. So lots of good stories in here. You may find some that may clash with a particular group's ideas or beliefs today, and you may find some that are similar. So once again, history changes. One of my favorite examples is the number 12. I guess back in the day when my family and I lived in Oklahoma, we would offer things at the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma's gift shop. And Cherokees in Oklahoma use a different word for number 12 than most Eastern Cherokees that live in the East still do today. That's as you can read on both the Eastern Band's page as well as the CNO's page, you can find that there are historical discrepancies between all of our cultures because of the numerous different clans of Cherokee. Some of us had different words we used. It depends on our proximity to this tribe or that tribe. We have different traditions. I can tell you from my own family's traditions how things were done and what I know about that. But someone of another Cherokee clan may have different stories that they uphold. And typically clans don't intermarry either. So there's so many ways that these things can get changed over time, and you always have to look at that. That's a big picture and it's very important. This is a book right here that I'm going to show you, Sun Circles and Human Hands, the Southeastern Indian Art Industry. Art and Industry. Edited by Emma Lilla Funderburk and Mary Douglas Funderburk Foreman, with a new foreword by Vernon James Knight Jr. This book has been around for a minute. This is a new copy of it, which I like quite a bit. This copy was copyrighted in 2001, originally 1957. So it's there again. Originally, this book's been around for a little while. I saved a page here to show you a picture, which isn't really a great picture because it's black and white from the 1950s. Above is a Choctaw flute or flageolet made of cane, wrapped with leather on top end, and a small effigy face carved under, the words are, like I said, 1957, carved under the top wind hole, burned cross-hatching decoration on the upper part, courtesy of the Smithsonian Institution, USNM, Dinsmore Collection, 365-17-4. So just to show you what a river cane flute might have looked like. Not sure when this river cane flute was collected. If you're interested, you can do a little bit more history and a little research on it, find out where it was from. But let's say a great book. This book here is, as it says, basically lots of imagery. This picture here is from Moundville, Alabama, which is somewhere I like to visit an awful lot. Hello, all of my friends in Moundville. Definitely miss being there all the time. But there's a lot of great imagery in this book from Southeastern Indians particularly, as well as Native Americans from just slightly over the border, because we shared a lot of ideas and traditions. Good book to look at. One more book here that I'm going to share with you really quick is The Secrets and Mysteries of the Cherokee Little People. And this is the, let me see here, the language edition by Lynn King Lausia. And it's a really neat book. The Little People are something that you may find stories about in a few of my other videos. We've discussed this kind of thing numerous times. The Little People have stories about everything from music to helping, in some cases hurting Native people. I find a lot of my friends in Oklahoma had stories about how the Little People were scary and really violent and what have you. And of course here in the East, I find that most people feel like they were helpful, including Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw. Most Southeastern Native people have stories about Little People. Of course, you look into it in depth, you find that most Native people have stories about Little People all over the world, as a matter of fact. So that's very, very important. There's some beautiful images in this book. I just want to share this with you. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I would recommend this book here. I like it a lot. I will tell you though, let's see here, written and illustrated by Lynn King Lausia, and the art on the title pages by Ernie Lausia, Cherokee Publications, Cherokee, North Carolina. It's actually published in Cherokee, North Carolina by a Cherokee publishing company in 1998. So this book, second printing 2002, and then third printing, which is this one, 2008. So there's stories in this book that are in historical language as well, which is kind of nice. It kind of helps you learn Cherokee a little bit in some ways. But this book is a modern book, and for me, most of the stories are fantastic. I love them, but some of them are a little more modern. So when you talk specifically about Cherokee Indian people, we usually talk about what period and what time frame and where from, you know, because if we're talking about Oklahoma in the late 1800s, you might have one idea versus in the Southeast, say anywhere in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, any of those kind of areas in, say, the 1750s. You know, we're talking a whole just life cycle different of things going on there. Also one of my very good friends that is a Homa Indian always reminds me, which, you know, is kind of not only an ongoing joke, but it's kind of a lot of truth to it, that they're pretty much what we call a Southern Cherokee. Homas live in Louisiana. So there's a lot of ideas and cultural sharings that we have all done. Stomp dance that I may have talked about in the past in other videos are typically a Choctaw type thing or a Muskogean type thing that Cherokee people do and have done for hundreds of years, but things that we've shared from other cultures, because historically there weren't really any, until more recent times, like say about 100 years ago, there weren't really a whole lot of Cherokee stomp dance songs. So all that aside, the reason I'm sharing this with you is the idea of what is tradition is very important. So what tradition is today may vary from what it was in the past. For example, a 5-hole flute is a traditional thing. Most people think that only 6-hole flutes were made. Native Americans made flutes of all types, and if you haven't seen any of my videos on that, please make sure you look, because we do have them. But 5-hole flutes were probably historically about the same time frame, same age historically as 6-hole flutes were. There were flutes that went back before those. So this is a more modern idea, for about 3,000 or 4,000 years modern, compared to the 8,000 years that we know of that people in this country have been making flutes. Does that mean that they didn't make flutes before that? No. It's likely that people did, but we don't have any examples of them in hand. So what is traditional is very important. It's an idea that a lot of people think will determine their future. It's an idea that a lot of people rely on, what is traditional. But in today's modern era, we will find people who will call this size flute traditional, or this size flute traditional. If it inspires you to play something in such a low tone, a low key as this instrument, then please, by all means, play it. However, I'm not going to tell you that that has been historically traditional from any time point. Native Americans, as far as we know, have never played any flute that large or that low in tone, especially not in the United States region of the Americas. It's not something that ever happened. Historically, to my knowledge, we have also never had one this size. This is a large flute for a Native American flute. It's a low E. This flute is like the ones that I play at the beginning of my intro of my other YouTube videos. So this flute is a low tone. It is not necessarily something that is traditional. We have not discovered any historical examples that I'm aware of a flute this large that played a tone that low. The idea that a Native American flute is a low instrument is one that comes from modern culture playing low tone flutes, which is not uncommon. It's like the most common thing in the world. Modern culture of Native American culture does play a lot of low tone flutes. Also, black and white movies like the Westerns that had come out. A lot of people considered those to be historical, when indeed they certainly were not. Many times Native Americans were played by other characters before the Indian Arts and Crafts Act and a few other laws that said that you have to use a Native American to portray a Native American. Although it doesn't seem like any other cultures have that going on, but to each his own. But in the Westerns, you hear a flute playing, but as I have on good account, a friend of ours out in Oklahoma told a story of the first people that played the flute in the Westerns, and they were a Native American that they had hired to come in and play this music. But they were an orchestral musician and had never played one of these instruments before. And going from having a flute that will play an entire chromatic scale using numerous fingerings and combinations of fingerings to make it play 2 or 3 octaves, going from that kind of flute to something more simple can be challenging. You might think that it's easier to play this, which it is, and you should be able to reverse engineer that, but for some people it's a little more challenging. So a lot of times the Native American that they had play in the Westerns would play a silver flute, and he would play what sounded like is considered to be Native American music. So with that in mind, silver flutes are usually in a low key, like the low key of B or low key of C, and that's a very low instrument, actually in the range of this dude right here. So historically, what we have found that Native American flutes were a little bit higher in tone, like this high B. However, they weren't in a key, so I can't really say that a B flute would be an exact key. This beautiful little tiny flute is probably a little more close to the original historical types that I have seen images of. You can scour the world looking for images of these things, and there's few and far in between that you'll find anything, but anyway, that one is a little bit closer, as well as this one in size, shape, style, things like that. So what is traditional? Typically, as much as I don't want to say it, is in the eye of the beholder. You might think tradition is one thing, other people might think it's another. You can do some historical research and you can find information about a specific tribe, but just because this book may not mention anything about flutes in it doesn't mean that the people didn't have flutes. Most of my flutes are a copy of an original Cherokee flute that I was fortunate enough to copy some 35 years ago from today. But this book here has some maps in it that I was discussing just before we started this video that show boundaries of Cherokee people, and these maps show places that is argued today as to whether Cherokee people live there. I know they live there because it's where a lot of my family's from, but a book from the 1900s, in the early 1900s, this one actually 1900, but this information may be argued by some, suggesting that it is not accurate. And most of the ideas that people have about what is and isn't traditional, especially if they get overly offended by it, are ideas that are already just riddled with perception and stereotypes. So keep that in mind. What is tradition? You know, there's a lot of ways I try to differentiate between them when I speak, because I try to be a good example for that kind of thing. However, not everybody may feel that same way. Now, to my story. Oh my gosh, one of my favorite stories. I guess I'm going to set this big one down since it's not a traditional flute, and I'm going to play it on this one. But I'm going to start off. I don't know if you hear the thunder in the background, but it's kind of a rainy day here where I'm at. I'm going to start off telling you a story. The first story I ever learned about the origin of the Native American flute. I've got other videos about this story, but it's kind of important that I tell you about it right now. And this will be a little quick story for you and something you can share with your friends and family or your loved ones. A long time ago, as you can imagine with anything, there was a time before there was a flute played in the Americas. And this time before the flute, there were all kinds of things that you could hear. You could hear birds singing. There were no cars, no airplanes going by. There was thunder and lightning and rain and beautiful sounding things that help you sleep at night like it did me when I grew up. But there was no sound of a flute. You might find people making sounds with their mouth, singing, doing throat singing, maybe making sounds with other instruments like a rattle or a drum. The drum, as a matter of fact, is said to be one of the first instruments. It's the sound of the heartbeat of the earth. And for that reason, we believe it's one of the oldest instruments that has been around. But the flute, there wasn't a sound of a flute. And I tell you this because, as with any story, they usually has a little bit of peril and a little bit of history in it as well. Oral stories are so important like that, and it's a good teaching tool. So if you keep in mind that this story dates back before Columbus landed on this continent, before Europeans had walked the land that we knew about, and before any modern civilization, as you can imagine, was around. As a matter of fact, if you'd like, you can go ahead and close your eyes and just think about what that might be like, and think about the people living in their communities and the things that they were doing every day and what their life was like. And as they're going about their every day, they had everything from food to taking care of the young and religion to consider, and the growing of a young man and a young woman. And so this young man in our story was coming of age, and it was time for him to find out what he was going to do in life. He didn't have colleges and fancy schools or trade schools like we do today. He had a tradition, and this tradition is certainly something that is very, very important, something his Yate taught him how to do. All of his people taught him the importance of tradition and what that meant to him. And so he carried on that tradition, and he went on his humbletia. He was going to go out in the woods basically for 4 days or so, and he's going to stay in a secluded area where one of his family members had prepared somewhere that we know that people don't go hunting. It's not on a regular path, so there's no deer or animals that cross over on this land. There's not a whole lot of anything out there, just woods, just trees and forest. So he goes out there and he's prepared and everything, and his family members leave him and tell him everything's going to be okay. They prepared him and told him what to expect when it happened to them when they had their humbletia. And so he stayed there. He was going to stay there for 4 days and nights without anything to eat and anything to drink, just him and nature. He didn't have a flute. He may have had an article with him of some importance, usually not a knife or a weapon of any kind, but he had his wit about him and knowing the area, and he was relaxed and was very calm. He was sitting there, and it had been a couple of days already. He'd been fasting, been praying. It was very quiet. Occasionally he may have heard a bird fly over. But all of a sudden he heard in the woods, and he looked over. And that kind of thing will wake you. And he looked over and he didn't see anything. He see maybe some bushes rustling around. And so he thought, okay, maybe it's just an animal, a little bird landed in a tree or something, some bushes. Maybe there's a deer that come up wondering what I'm doing here. And so he sits there, he's relaxed, and he hears again. And this time it's a little more startling because he thought he'd seen something. He thought he'd seen something move at that last rustling. So he kind of jumped up from his circle that he was in. And when he jumped up, he looked around, didn't see anything else, no sign that something was causing a disturbance around there or what have you. And he kind of watched for a moment, and he thought he seen some movement out of the corner of his eye. And to him, he thought, well, this is great. This is how I'm going to find out who I'm going to be. This is the important part of my life is about to come into view, and I'm about to find out where I'm going in life, what I'm going to do. I might be a great hunter or a great leader. I might teach my people more about this or about that, or I may get a fantastic article or something that is going to be a very important, thing I should bring back to my people and show them. Some type of talisman, a lot of people call them. A lot of times when we have talismans, they're those important articles that we have on our possession, and we need to share them sometimes. Some of them we have to protect from bad and negative spirits. But he looks up and he looks all over, and he's kind of a little groggy and a little leery, a little apprehensive, because once again he's been fasting for several days and been relaxed and everything. But he jumps up really alert, and he sees it, and he doesn't recognize what it is, but he takes off after it. And as he runs, the faster he runs, it seems like the faster whatever this is he's chasing is getting away from him. And so he's chasing it, and the briars are cutting his legs, and he's running as fast as he can, and he's thinking, this is it. They're going to call me something like Fast Elk or something like this. There's so many famous native people that I can think of that are this is their life story right here, and I'm going to catch whatever this is, and it's going to make me a great person. So he's running as fast as he can, and he gets out to a clearing, and there's nothing there. It's just a wide open clearing. He sees a stream in front of him, and he sees just trees and kind of open, and he sees what looks like the footprints of like an elk or maybe a deer, and he's looking on the ground down there, and he's checking everything out, and they come right up to the edge of the water, but then they don't go any further, of course. He thinks maybe it jumped in the water. If it's a deer, deer typically try to swim upstream unless the current's carrying them too heavily. These are lessons he's learned already as a young hunter. And downstream he looks in case the animal was injured, or maybe if the water's current's too fast, and he doesn't see anything struggling to swim or catch the bank anywhere. And he looks upstream where it would be swimming if it was going that way, and he doesn't see anything over there either. He looks across the stream, nothing. There's no footprints on the other side. He doesn't see where it may be surfaced. And so he's kind of frustrated, as you would be, or if you can consider fasting for that many days, just a little confused about what's happening, why it is that he thought he'd seen an animal that he didn't. So he takes that breath, and he relaxes, and he remembers his teaching. So he kind of sits down by a patch of reed next to the water, and in this patch of reed, the wind is blowing, and it's kind of calming, and he sees the reed blowing back and forth like this right here. And as it's blowing back and forth, he figures this is a good place to take a break for a moment. He knows what his situation is. He has been fasting for days and been meditating, and he thinks, I'm just going to sit beside this swaying patch of reed and relax for a moment. So he does that, and just about the time that he almost dozes off, he hears and for the first time, he heard a melody that he had never experienced before. It wasn't someone singing, and it wasn't a bird song. It was amazing, just a melody that kind of rang off there by itself. And he looks up, and he noticed one of those pieces of cane that was blowing back and forth was a little different than all of the others. It had some holes on the top of it, and a little piece up here on the top. Maybe not like this one, but something like that. And it was short. The piece was broke off on top, so there was no growth coming out of it. And so he thinks, that's it. That's the sound I just heard. That is the one thing that stands out here. Don't know why I didn't notice it before. So he snaps it off, and he runs back to his family, back to his tribe, as fast as he can. This time he takes the shortcut because he knows where he's at, and he brings this back to all the people in the tribe, and he asks them, what is this? Do you know how to make it sound? How to make it sing like it did before when I was at the river? And he asked everyone, and nobody had an idea of where this thing come from, what it was. They've never seen one of these before. And so, he's kind of wondering what he should do. So he goes to the oldest and wisest person in his tribe in the village there, and he asks them, what should I do? And they say, well, just like many of the old talismans that we have that are so important, the ones that are just held deep in our hearts, the things that we've been given by the Spirit, he says we should take this back to where you found it and hold it there and see if maybe some kind of energy or magic or something happens that we don't have here with us, because it takes something more to make it play. So he does that, and he's very patient. Young people used to be very patient back in the day. He takes it back to the cane patch and he holds it up there, and as the wind is blowing really gently, a little bird, a little woodpecker, lands up here on the top, and he wiggles the block a little bit, and then you hear when he finished his little song, he landed down in front of him and turned into a little person. And he told the young man that this is a flute, and I want you to take it back to your people and share it with them, because I'm getting tired of hearing the drums play all the time. Now, this story, like I said, is one of my favorite flute stories, one of my favorite origin stories for the flute. And the ending is a little different than the one I heard originally. It's actually an ending that a friend of mine, who is a storyteller, had told, and I like the way she told it a lot, so I kind of carried it along with me with my story. And so, once again, this is a Plains Indian story about the flute origin. It's not to say that there weren't original stories about the flute with other cultures. A lot of those stories kind of get wiped away by the test of time, as you would say. During the removal to Oklahoma, there were a lot of things that have changed. Some of those cultural ideas that aren't the same as what they are here in the east of the United States. Does that make them wrong? Does that make them incorrect? No. We have a hard time thinking about what the stories would have been of a different clan of Cherokee or a different tribe of people, and imagining how accurate or inaccurate those stories may be. Once again, we have so very few historical references. This is a very thick book about Native American stories. I'm going to read you a real quick story here, and you'll forgive me with any of my mispronunciations, because I don't read this particular version of these stories all the time, so it's important. This is on page 335. Anyone that's looking for this kind of thing, the removed townhomes. Long ago, long before the Cherokee were driven from their homes in 1838, the people on Valley River and Hiwassee heard voices of invisible spirits in the air, calling and warning them of wars and misfortunes, which the future held in store, and inviting them to come and live with the Nenehi, the immortals, in their homes under the mountains and under the waters. For days the voices hung in the air, and the people listened until they heard the spirits say, "If you would live with us, gather everyone in your townhomes and fast. Therefore, live with us." Let me see. Make sure I didn't skip ahead. "For 7 days, and no one must raise a shout or a war whoop in all that time." In other words, don't have any negative feelings. Don't say any cuss words. "Do this, and we shall come, and you will see us, and we'll take you to live with us." So this is back before they even let us see them. The people were afraid of the evils that were to come, and they knew that the immortals of the mountain and the waters were happy forever, so they counseled in their townhomes and decided to go with them. Those of the Anasagaye town came all together into their townhouse and prayed and fasted for 6 days. On the 7th day, there was a sound from a distant mountains, and it came nearer and grew louder until a roar of thunder was all about the townhome, and they felt the ground shake under them. Now they were frightened, and despite the warning, some of them screamed out. The Nenehi, who had already lifted up the townhome with its mound to carry it away, were startled by the cry and let part of it fall into the earth, where now we see the mound of Tsetsi. They steadied themselves again and bore the rest of the townhome with all the people in it, and the top of the Tsudaye Lunyi, the lone peak near the head of Chihuahua, where we can still see it, changed long ago into solid rock, but the people are invisible and immortal. And this Toyela is actually a beautiful place. I have been there, and it's something that you don't see every day. One of those really special places. The people of another town on Hiwassee, at the place which we call the Mooney, where Shooting Creek comes in, also prayed and fasted, and at the end of 7 days, Nunehi came and took them back away down under the water. They are there now, and on warm summer days, when the wind ripples the surface, those who listen can hear them talking below. When the Cherokee drag the river for fish, the fish drag always stops and catches there, although the water is deep and the people know it is being held by their lost kinsmen who do not want to be forgotten. When the Cherokee were forcibly removed to the west, one of the greatest regrets of those along Hiwassee and the valley rivers was that they were compelled to leave behind forever their rivers who had gone to the Nunehi, their relatives who had gone there. And Tennessee River, near Kingston, 18 miles below Loudon, Tennessee, is a place which the Cherokee call Goodsey. And Goodsey, where there was once a settlement long ago, but one night, while the people were gathered in the town house for a dance, the bank caved in and carried them all down the river. Boatmen passing the spot in their canoes see the round dome of the townhouse now turned to stone in the water below them, and sometimes hear the sound of the drum and dances coming up, and they never fail to throw food into the water in return for being allowed to cross safely. So these are some really great stories, like I said, but the reason I wanted to share them with you really quickly here is simply because the flute, the idea that you have about the flute, whether it be conceived from watching old westerns or from hearing another flute player play or from beautiful stories about old Native American people back in the day, what inspires you is so critically important. That inspiration is the only reason you play this instrument. Some people may play it for money today, but it started off with an inspiration. For me, the inspiration was my granddad and some of my cousins, people who had already made flutes and played them. I loved it. I was a musician, and I thought this is the most amazing thing. I had already been set up by a non-native music teacher who told me about my people's flutes, and then I went on a kind of a hunt looking for them and found them in my own family, which was wonderful. So those kind of things are really, really important. And how you play the flute is something that you have to think about. It's something that you come up with yourself. My videos and everything anybody does to teach you something can help give you a boost or give you some I guess, inspiration in a lot of ways. Can give you a kickstart, but it is on you to keep pedaling that bicycle. And for that reason, one other technique, other than your inspiration, which is so critical, anyway, one other technique that I'm going to share with you is how to figure out what you're going to play next. Now, considering inspiration, going back to the inspiration technique, it could be this book here. You may feel like you need to go to a special place to go play the flute, and that might be the case. I know that during 2020, when I first started these flute playing classes, back when I had them live, I had a lot of things to consider. There were a lot of changes going on in the world at that time. Anybody that looks historically back on that time, you know what I'm talking about. People weren't allowed to travel as much then, so going to a special location may not have been an option for some people, and we discussed that in my classes. Some people could go to that special location, but a special location doesn't have to be the rocks and the streams and the river and the mountains. It doesn't have to be that. It could be something simple. That special location could be in front of your pet cat. I mean, cats love to hear the flute play. They really do. They're mesmerized by it. It's no wonder there's not more stories about people in other countries playing the cat a flute instead of a snake. But the animals love to hear you play the flute. It's not something they get to experience in their life an awful lot. It's kind of new to them and their people. So they hear sounds and voices and music playing off in the distance, but they don't know what to make of it sometimes. Sometimes they do. But showing them your instrument, showing them what it's about, you might find some great presence there. You might find something amazing. But another thing that inspires me to play as a musician, I've been playing for most of my life, been playing the flute here for a long time. Something that inspires me is an area with good acoustics. Good acoustics is so important when you feel like you're not getting everything out of the flute that you want. good acoustics are important. Or that special setting. If you can get to a rock and some streams, if that's what floats your boat, please get in that boat and see where it takes you. But if you're looking for acoustics like I do, it doesn't always come out of a machine or off of a piece of software or anything like that. If you go into a room in your house, if you go into a special building, I'd like to mention someone who has reportedly, I guess, done this historically. Weird Al Yankovic recorded his first album inside of a bathroom in a college. And those bathrooms have big flat walls with very few shapely, I guess, decor. No curtains, no blinds, maybe a mirror, something like that, but it's mostly flat, hard surface. And those flat, hard surfaces make an excellent reverberation. They give you an excellent acoustic. As a matter of fact, in recording software, it's called a large room for a reason, because it sounds like the acoustics from a large room. You may not hear much in the room I'm in because there are pictures and pieces of equipment and this and that and the other all over the place, but you can hear some of the reverberation, especially if I speak up. So if you look for that kind of thing, you can certainly find it, and you can certainly find a way to make use of it. And the last technique, like I said, is where you decide what you're going to play next. Playing what you're going to play next is so important. If you play slowly, I can decide to take 2 fingers off or to take 1 finger off, or I can decide how I'm going to change my notes. Playing slowly and deciding to take those long notes as an opportunity. Playing those long notes as an opportunity will give you an opportunity to find out what you should play next. So something to think about. Anyway, lots of other good videos to come and more for your flute classes. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I look forward to seeing you here again very soon. Charlie Mato-Toyela signing out for Blueberry Flutes, and happy flute playing.